Welcome, everyone, to this calm narrative study of John 3:30, where I must decrease. Let's jump right in. For today's full summary, we are drawing from some absolutely incredible source channels: Inspiring Philosophy, Christ Overall, Sweet Incense, and Got Questions Ministries. A link is below in the description box. Also, the I Must Decrease channel says prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated, and give a hype and like, please. All right, let's dive into this deep contextual study.
On our agenda for this study, we're taking a real detective approach to solve a deeply misunderstood mystery. We're going to start with the controversial verse itself, then move to nations, not individuals. After that, we'll unpack the biblical meaning of hate, God's blessings on Esau, love through strict discipline, and, finally, wrap things up with ultimate mercy for all.
Section 1. The controversial verse. We begin by looking directly at a scriptural text that has sparked, centuries of intense theological debate. Romans 9:13 says, "As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated." Now, if you read this verse entirely in isolation, it implies a rather disturbing premise, doesn't it? It challenges our fundamental understanding of a loving, just God. It literally suggests this terrifying idea that God possesses an arbitrary, fatalistic hatred for specific individuals long before they are even born or have done anything wrong. This is a verse that has caused immense anxiety for believers throughout history. People are left wondering if they, or maybe their loved ones, might just arbitrarily be on the hated side of the equation.
So we have to ask, does God literally hate individuals? To answer this absolutely pivotal question, we need to take a step back. When the Apostle Paul writes this in his letter to the Romans, he's actually quoting directly from the ancient Jewish scriptures. He fully expects his first-century audience, especially the Jewish believers, to instantly recognize that background. He isn't introducing some new, shocking doctrine here. He's referencing a story they already know intimately. So let's zoom out. Let's investigate what the original text actually says in its proper historical setting to see if it really supports this idea of individual, predetermined hatred. Which brings us to Section 2, nations, not individuals. Let's go back to Genesis 25, the exact passage Paul is heavily referencing. Picture the scene. Rebekah is pregnant with twins, Jacob and Esau, and there is an intense, agonizing struggle going on inside her womb. It's so severe that she cries out to God, basically asking why this is happening to her. And God answers her anxiety with a profound prophecy. He says, "Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels." Notice the specific wording here. God was explicitly talking about the birth and destiny of two distinct nations. This divine decree was never about determining the eternal spiritual salvation of two individual babies. It was about God sovereignly choosing the geopolitical lineage through which he would work out his grand covenant in the world.
This concept of corporate election is just absolutely fascinating once you grasp it. In ancient Near Eastern thought, the individuals in these texts actually stand in the place of the nations they represent for God's sovereign covenantal purposes. The names are literally synonymous with the empires. Jacob represents the Israelites, Esau represents the Edomites, and as we'll see a bit later in the story of the Exodus, Pharaoh represents the Egyptians. God deals covenantally through these massive people groups to bring about his global plans. When we try to shrink these massive, epic national prophecies down into individual salvation, we completely miss the scale of what God is actually orchestrating in human history.
Tracing this massive historical narrative reveals God's strategy. In the Old Testament, God chose to work primarily through Israel. Why? Well, not because they were intrinsically better than anyone else, but so they could act as a priesthood. They were meant to be a blazing light, drawing all other nations in the ancient world to worship the one true God. But, as you probably know, we see a tragic historical failure. Israel repeatedly rebelled, broke the covenant, chased after idols, and completely failed to be that light to the surrounding world. So, what happens moving into the New Testament era? Paul explains that God temporarily and partially cuts them off. He then pivots, beginning to work directly through the Gentiles to bring about worldwide salvation. And the ultimate masterstroke of all this? Bringing the Gentiles in is designed to make Israel jealous, which ultimately brings them back to faith as well. It's a breathtaking, multi-millennial strategy of redemption.
Let's transition to Section 3, the biblical meaning of hate.
Okay, so we still have that incredibly strong, uncomfortable word, hate, to deal with. This is exactly where the linguistic gap between ancient Hebrew and modern English causes massive theological confusion. It's so easy to overlay our modern emotional understanding of hatred, which implies malice, rage, and a desire to destroy, onto what is actually an ancient covenantal and legal term.
In a biblical context, to hate is an idiom meaning to prefer less or to favor one over another for a specific covenantal purpose. It has absolutely nothing to do with human emotional malice. So when God says he hated Esau, it simply means he made a sovereign choice to work his messianic lineage through Abraham's son Isaac and then through Jacob rather than through Esau. He simply preferred Jacob for the job.
This becomes crystal clear when we look at how Jesus himself used this exact same ancient idiom. Compare his teachings in Matthew 10 and Luke 14. In Matthew, Jesus says, "He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." But over in Luke, he phrases the exact same teaching this way: "If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother, he cannot be my disciple." Now, in first-century Judea, honoring your father and mother was one of the absolute highest moral commands. It carried immense cultural weight. Does Jesus literally want you to despise your parents with malice? Of course not. He commands us to honor and care for them. Hate in this context clearly means to love less, or to place your preference and loyalty in God first.
We see this idiomatic usage repeatedly in the Old Testament law too. Deuteronomy 21:15 says, "If a man have two wives, one beloved and another hated." Think back to Jacob's own family dynamic. He had two wives, Rachel and Leah. The text tells us Jacob had a clear preference for Rachel, but he didn't literally hate Leah with malice. She was his wife and the mother to many of his children. He just preferred Rachel. The law in Deuteronomy exists to protect the hated or less preferred wife's firstborn from being passed over for inheritance. It perfectly solidifies that this specific biblical idiom is entirely about comparison, priority, and preference. It's not about literal emotional hatred.
This leads us right into Section 4, God's blessings on Esau.
So the crucial point we have to wrestle with is this. If God merely preferred less for the covenant, did he still actually bless Esau? The answer is yes, immensely. The historical evidence of God's deep love, provision, and fierce protection for Esau's descendants, the Edomites, is thoroughly documented in Deuteronomy chapter 2. God gifted the mountainous, fortified region of Mount Seir to Esau as a permanent, divine possession. When the Israelites were marching toward the Promised Land, God strictly warned them not to attack or even meddle with Edom. He told Moses that he wouldn't give Israel even a footbreadth of Edom's land because it belonged to Esau. Furthermore, God miraculously empowered the Edomites to defeat the Horites, a terrifying giant people group who previously inhabited that region.
Consider this exact biblical parallel. Just as God destroyed the terrifying Anakim giants for Israel so they could claim their promised land, he destroyed the Horite giants for Esau so the Edomites could claim theirs. God literally fought for the sons of Esau. He drove out their enemies, gave them a wealthy inheritance, and fiercely protected their borders from invaders, including protecting them from Israel. You really have to ask yourself, how could God possibly have fought for Esau's descendants, blessed them so profoundly, and protected their land if he literally hated them in the way modern English uses the word? It just doesn't fit the biblical narrative at all.
Let's move to Section 5, Love Through Strict Discipline.
This builds a profound theological perspective on how God's love and wrath are uniquely manifested in the lives of these two men. When we compare their paths, a fascinating reversal happens. Esau's path was marked by immense worldly prosperity, military might, and power without any divine discipline. God fulfilled his promises to Abraham, made Esau a great nation, and essentially let him live exactly how he wanted to live without intervening to correct his character. But Jacob's path, his was filled with severe trials, strict discipline, exile, and immense hardship. God simply would not allow Jacob to continue being the selfish deceiver he was born as.
We see the true climax of this discipline in Genesis 32. Jacob spends the entire night wrestling a mysterious divine figure in the dirt until daybreak. He refuses to let go until he is blessed. In response, God dislocates Jacob's hip, giving him a permanent physical reminder of his profound dependence on the Almighty. As the scripture reminds us, after that encounter, he entered in limping. God physically beat the deception and self-reliance out of Jacob because he loved him deeply. You see, God's ultimate goal for his children isn't uninterrupted prosperity, total health, or your best life now. It is holiness. Jacob's permanent limp was the mark of a loving father refusing to let his child remain entrenched in his idols. In a strange, sobering twist, God leaving Esau entirely alone to enjoy his worldly success without correction was actually a far heavier path than the severe, loving discipline he continually poured out on Jacob.
And finally, we arrive at Section 6, Ultimate Mercy for All. Bringing this study to its grand conclusion, we have to look at God's ultimate overarching purpose for both the chosen nations and the unchosen nations. Some people point to the story of Pharaoh as undeniable proof that God arbitrarily creates certain people solely for destruction. But the text of Exodus reveals something completely different. Pharaoh was raised up to display God's power specifically so that the Egyptians could know Jehovah. The 10 plagues weren't just mindless destruction, they were a systematic, highly public dismantling of the false Egyptian pantheon. God hardening Pharaoh's heart prolonged the confrontation, providing irrefutable proof through incredible miracles so that the Egyptians, alongside the Israelites, could finally know the one true God and be saved. It reframes the entire Exodus narrative as a massive act of severe, wide-reaching mercy.
And here is the true, breathtaking climax of Paul's argument. People who stop reading at the end of Romans 9 completely miss the glorious conclusion Paul lands on in Romans 11:32. Paul starts chapter 9 in deep, crushing anguish for his people Israel. But by the end of chapter 11, he is breaking out into spontaneous worship because he finally sees the sheer brilliance of God's inclusive mercy. He writes, "For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all." God's temporary hardening of certain groups, or his choice to work through specific nations like Israel at specific times in history, is a masterful, sovereign, long-term plan. And what is the final goal of that master plan? To ultimately show mercy to absolutely everyone.
The incredible truth we must grasp is that God's mercy extends to all unbelievers. Think about the leveling ground of the gospel. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you are of the line of Jacob or the line of Esau, literally everyone starts out their life as an unbeliever before coming to faith. Because God has concluded everyone in that state of unbelief, his sovereign master plan fundamentally includes the desire to show mercy to every single person. The cross of Christ tears down the dividing walls between the chosen and the unchosen nations. Nobody is excluded from the vast reach of God's immense desire to save, heal, and restore.
This brings us to a provocative final thought for our study. If God's ultimate goal is mercy for all, how does that fundamentally change the way we view his discipline today? When we face immense hardships, it's so easy to feel like God has abandoned us or hates us. But as we've seen, a severe trial or even a permanent limp might actually be the deepest sign of divine love, keeping us anchored to him. When we look at Romans 9 in its proper historical and textual context, we don't find an arbitrary fatalistic God who hates individuals before they are even born. We find a deeply loving, meticulously sovereign God working a magnificent tapestry through empires, covenants, and strict, loving discipline, all driving toward a staggering conclusion of universal mercy. Thank you for joining me for this study. Keep digging into the context, and I'll see you next time.